All right, guys, welcome back to the AC Insider Podcast. This week, we're doing a deep dive with Bernie Schultz, and we are talking about vegetation. For those that don't know, Bernie has been in the industry for quite some time, over 363 tournaments listed on bass. So clearly the man knows a thing or two about tournament bass fishing. Over the years, he's acquired over $1 million, and a lot of that has been attributed to vegetation in one way or another. So that's what we're going to talk to Mr. Schultz about today. Bernie, welcome to the AC Insider Podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Danny. Appreciate it.
No problem. Hey, we were talking before we started recording, and you're known as a Florida angler, and our own AC Insider, Vance McCullough, is a Florida guy. And Vance and I were talking about tactics and things that we'd like to share with our listeners. And we got on the subject of vegetation. And I know you've been on a little bit of a hiatus, a torn bicep, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm still wearing the brace. I'm going through physical therapy. The reconnective surgery was successful, and everything looks good. The outlook's good. It's just gonna be a lot of physical therapy.
They feel like you'll be out slinging baits next year on the Elite Series again?
That's the plan. Yes, sir. I'm kind of anxious to get this thing off and throwing again.
Do you have them tighten things up so you can cast farther? Maybe add a little bit to it, kind of bionic like that?
Yeah, that'd be good. We'll see. You never know.
Well, as we mentioned, I know you and Vance have some history, and I want you guys to maybe kick it off just talking about, as Florida fishermen, I know it's a very important thing in Florida, but you've kind of shown that it matters everywhere. And if you guys would, Vance, why don't you take it over and talk a little bit about what Florida fishing means, or what vegetation means to guys like you and Bernie?
Yeah, Bernie, good to talk to you again. I know we fished together. I filmed some stuff for Angler Channel years ago where Bernie was flipped up, I don't know, a 40-pound limit of bass on typical flipping gear and braided line and some heavy hydrilla. And then, of course, recently, a couple of years ago, Bernie had a really good tournament on Santee Cooper when the eelgrass is starting to come back. And I know, Bernie, we talk a lot about vegetation as a broad term. Are you happy around any kind of grass, or is there a particular kind that you particularly look for when you go from, across the country? Is there a wheelhouse there you're more comfortable in, or are you just playing whatever the playing field gives you there?
A little of both. I mean, there's definitely preferred types of vegetation that are well known for holding bass across the country. Hydrilla, milfoil, eelgrass can be very productive. Certain types of pond weeds, lily pads, bulrushes, flat cattail reeds. There's all kinds of vegetation. There are also certain types of grasses that don't hold fish very well. Some naiads, sometimes coarse coontail is not very productive. It can be productive if there's not another option, but that's kind of the biggest challenge when you're dealing with lakes, no matter where you are in the country, is trying to read the grass and figuring out which particular type of vegetation they're relating to, or if it's a mixture of vegetation.
So let's say you get to a lake like Okeechobee. You're from Arkansas. I know Mark Davis mentioned the first time they opened those locks up and he saw the lake, his jaws just went slack. Like, where do I even begin in this massive field of grass?
Yeah.
Give a guy a tip. You know what I mean? Where do you begin? How do you break the fishery down?
Yeah, Okeechobee is an anomaly. I mean, it's a salad bowl and shallow for the most part. The vegetation grows in less than about 6 or 7 feet of water. There are so many types of, invasives as well as indigenous plants that grow there. Things to look for are irregularities. I'll start on points of vegetation. If I don't know a body of water, I'll start on the deepest point of a grass line and work my way in until I start connecting with fish. And I may go from, one type of grass to where it transitions to a different type of grass, or the grass gets thinner. There might be open holes behind an outside edge. It might be a void between that outside apron of grass and the shoreline. There's a lot of things to consider when you're trying to pick apart a grass bed, but basically I'm going to use lures that cover water and give me an opportunity to, try trigger fish from a different depths, whether they're in a foot of water or 6 feet of water or somewhere in between. I'm going to use moving baits that try to help me locate those fish. It may not be the best bait to perform on tournament day, but at least it'll give the fish away or have them give themselves away, so that I know the approximate depth and the type of cover they're related to, or what grass they're most related to. And again, something to really key on are irregularities, points of grass, pockets in the grass, voids behind grass, or where there's mixtures of different vegetations.
So when you get on a lake and you break it down and you're fishing fast in practice, and they're going to slow down and hammer on the areas where you got bites during the tournament, do you find often that you're able to expand your area as the tournament goes on, or are you dialing down more and more and more? How widespread do those bass tend to be in grass fisheries? Do they hold in certain areas? Do they move around a lot? I'm speaking of broad generalities, but
Yeah. Case in point, this year we started on Lake Okeechobee on the Bass Elite Series, and I had the lead the first day with a 28-pound bag, and I caught those fish within a cast of my boat. I mean, literally a long cast in 360 degrees of where I started. That's where I caught all those fish. Ideally, you would like to be able to expand to other areas that look the same, offer the same general composition of different grasses or depth and bottom type, whether it's firm bottom, soft bottom, or what the composition is. Unfortunately, in the case of Okeechobee, I wasn't able to do that, and I suffered as a result. The other areas that looked like it and had the same potential had other anglers, and I didn't want to encroach on anybody. So I kind of fished out the area I was in. I tried to expand to areas where there were no fishermen, but there weren't many fish. That's not always the case, though. Like I said, Okeechobee was kind of an anomaly this year. A good percentage of the lake was not healthy. As you well know, there's been a just incredible amount of spraying and weed control, and it's yielded a large percentage of the lake as non-productive. The bass in Okeechobee are side feeders. They gravitate towards clear water and healthy habitat, and that was a premium when we were there back in February. So that's not always the case. In many instances, you can expand to other parts of the lake and find the same basic formula, if you will, of different grasses, right bottom, right water clarity, everything coming together so that you can make the pattern repeat itself. But like I said, Okeechobee was a unique situation, and I kind of got burned after the first day. I just could never follow up with a big catch. I kind of fished out what I had.
That's a subject for the upcoming ACN with Angler Channel Bass Wrap Up TV show that will air on Discovery this quarter and on Pursuit in the spring. We're going to do a segment about all the spraying in Florida. We talked to some friends, guides up on the Kissimmee chain. We're going to talk to Scott Martin from Lake Okeechobee down there and get a little background on that. But that is an issue that was very much concern to our state, is the spraying of the grass, and not just making it harder for us to catch fish. I mean, Scott said, they had that tournament that had 30 bags over 30 pounds. Well, as soon as those fish came off the bed the next week, the hammers were only catching like 17 pounds down there at a 150 boat tournament. So
yeah,
they come off the bed, they got nowhere to go. So that's definitely a water quality issue we need to address. And I appreciate you bringing that up. I know Danny has something here.
Yeah, well, you guys, you're hitting on it now. You're hitting on a man-made cause. But, I'm in the Midwest, and Bernie up here, we're going to go through a fall turnover. Days are getting shorter. Water's getting cooler. One thing that I've always wondered as an angler, we'll see, we've got a couple different kinds of grasses. We don't have hydrilla, but we've got some shoreline vegetation that grows out. That's going to start dying off. You'll still have sticks and roots, stalks, but you won't have that leafy canopy cover. And then we have more like that coontail and a type of milfoil. But when that stuff starts dying, I always hear, club level anglers, local anglers talking about, well, the grass is dying, the fish are leaving, or, hey, that dead grass held some fish in it because it was warmer. How important, in your case, you're talking about Florida killing the grass. How important is the life cycle of the grass naturally? And does it as you head into fall and it starts to break down, do fish still want to be there, or do they want to leave?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you know, our grass cycles on its own also. Even though we're kind of a 12-month period for growth, it does slow down. There is a die off if we have extreme cold fronts. Plus, we have a lot of waterfowl that come in the wintertime and feed off the vegetation, which kind of helps crop it off. But
Okay.
regardless of where I go, I would prefer to fish healthy new growth. You know, whether it's at the top of stranding hydrilla as it reaches the surface, or if it's the deep water edge or the shallow water edge where it's expanding laterally from where it starts. I always try to find healthy new growth if that's an option. When grass starts dying off, you know, it's like a kind of $1 million question. Do the fish stay or do they leave? Many cases in my travels, it seemed like, from my experiences, a lot of times schooling starts taking over. So the grass may not be, it's relative to where the fish are located. They might be schooling off the points of grass or in pockets in the grass, or you know, channels through the grass where boat traffic is common. Places like that where there's, you know, locations where they can corral and ambush bait fish. They're not in the grass per se, but grass is still pertinent to what's going on. So,
Okay, that
you
makes
know,
sense.
I think if I can't find them in the grass, or I'm not able to find healthy new growth, then I'm gonna start looking adjacent to the grass, whether it's shell beds or other types of, it might be wood cover, it might be stump beds, it might be a drop off, or it could be just open water schooling fish.
Basically slid out to something a little fresher than maybe that grass that was dying. And that's been my thought. I have a background in limnology, or the study of lakes. A good green grass bed's pumping oxygen into the water, right? In the summertime, that's a critical thing. Likewise, a brown dying grass bed, decomposition's consuming oxygen. So my mind has always lent itself towards exactly what you said. I'd prefer a green one. I'm suspect of the brown ones, but I think you probably gave us the best tip there, and that is, they didn't abandon and go to the other end of the lake because the grass was dying. They just have repositioned somewhere nearby, and maybe that's an edge that hasn't died yet, or the next piece of hardcover or drop out away from it. So that's a great point on that. And I didn't think about the fact that waterfowl vegetation. I didn't think about the fact that in Florida, I fished there and I've seen you guys have so many birds, but I never thought about the fact that they're in there essentially mowing your lawn every winter, aren't they?
Yeah, that's a common thing, especially when the coots show up. You know, it's whether grass is dying or it's healthy. It's all about the forage, especially this time of year. So my advice to anybody, whether it's a you know, a lake with a lot of vegetation or sparse vegetation, if the forage is related to the grass in some form or fashion, whether they're in it or schooled outside of it, that's where I'm going to try and focus my efforts. I think the bass are going to be key on the forage and its location, and trying to fatten up for the winter.
Kind of like they're picking on everybody that's up at the salad bar.
That's
They're
it.
The bullies of the salad bar. I like it. Hey, you mentioned a naiad, and I'm working on a pond here, a personal project that I'm dealing with some naiad, and you were specific to mention that as a not productive grass. When I look at what's growing around the pond, is it because it's so thick, like they can't move around in it? I mean, it's almost like it's its own sponge, and I've noticed we don't catch any fish around it. It looks great from the shoreline, but the bass just don't seem to use it. Is that a density thing, you think?
That probably contributes to it. I mean, they need some room to move. They'll get in really dense hydrilla, but people need to realize what they see at the surface or near the surface with real thick hydrilla is not the case down below. That plant mushrooms as it gets closer to the surface. So especially when it gets dense, Vance, you're very familiar with this with our fishing trips. That canopy will actually deny sunlight to the lower portions of the plant, which ultimately creates a cavernous type situation where there's these big open areas beneath the matted layer on the surface, and the bass will congregate in those caverns. And you know, I had a day with you know, a once in a lifetime day with Vance filming, catching big largemouth, Florida strain largemouth under matted vegetation. And it was because there was a void beneath that where they could collect. And I mean, we didn't fish 50 yards. I caught over probably 30 fish over 7 or 8 pounds in a stretch 50 yards long, just going back and forth over the same, piece of water.
And
What I
how do
remember
you
about that, I
go
was
ahead?
just gonna say we moved around, a quarter mile away to another little bay, and Bernie started catching fish there on a buzz bait in areas that were not matted. They were clumpy hydrilla. You know what I mean? And so it's a totally different kind of setup, and you change tactics based on that same body of water.
Right.
I'm just wondering, people have to understand again what is on the bottom versus what they're seeing with their eyes and how that dictates your approach.
Well, the other thing to that, in that scenario where we found fish in another location, fish are like people. They're not all doing the same thing at the same time. There's some will
Mhm.
group up and some are rogues. Some are feeding by sight or some are following pods of bait fish, especially this time of year. The key thing about grass is that forage and bass gravitate to vegetation, whether they're in it or relating to the edge of it. Somehow, if there's quality vegetation in a lake, that's a good starting point to find bass.
Talk to us a little bit
And if
about
we
lure selection. That's the question I want from Bernie. I want to know when you pull up, and I know it's different per vegetation, right? A hydrilla mat, you're probably going to punch through versus something that's not topped out. But Bernie, over your career, if you had to pick 3 or 4 grass baits, what are they?
I don't know if I could narrow it to 3 or 4.
Well, give me the top 10 then, if you
Yeah,
need
let's
10.
do that. And I'm going to take it from top to bottom, top of the water column to the bottom. Top waters, like Vance has had some great days on the water with me using prop baits and buzz baits. Those are gimmies. Walking baits, poppers, prop baits, especially, it seems like in the extreme south, are really effective around fields of grass, whether they're topped out or slightly below the surface. So definitely want to include topwater baits of all kinds: walking, popping, chugging, buzzing, and that can include soft plastics that are retrieved at a high rate of speed, like a toad,
Mhm.
or hollow belly frogs. All those have their place. And then the next group of lures would be probably jerk baits. Jerk baits are very effective around vegetation, whether you're fishing over the top of stranding hydrilla or submerged milfoil, or the deep edge or shallow edge of a field of grass where it's, you're working a clean edge of the grass itself with a jerk bait. They can be very effective. Lipless crankbaits, super effective, especially ripping them through the stalks of stranding grass like hydrilla and milfoil, eelgrass. All those are really good for ripping a lipless crankbait. And that also works for shallow running billed crankbait, especially square bills. Like I like the Macbeth square bills. They work really well. Any number of square bills, or even sometimes a round bill type crankbait or a shad wrap can be very effective around stranding grass. Then you get to, chatter baits, spinner baits, swim jigs, that type of thing, swim baits. All those are, those are good at reading water or eliminating water and putting you closer to the fish. When you get a bite, it may not be the best lure ultimately, but it can, in many cases, give the fish away, give their location
Mhm.
away. And then when I find a concentration of fish, or I find a good depth zone that I'm going to focus on, or a composition of the right grass and bottom structure, then I might use bottom probing baits like jigs or soft plastic worms and drop shots and whatnot. And it can be everything from light line to heavy braided flipping and pitching rigs. So there's a lot of versatility involved, and that's, I think, kind of been my advantage over my career, is that I was forced to be versatile in my approach, just simply because in Florida there is so much variety, and if you don't adapt to all the changes that you encounter, then you're not going to do very well. And that's kind of been my survival traveling outside of Florida. So to answer your question, I mean, all of those lure groups are applicable and effective in finding and catching bass in grass.
Yeah, I think the takeaway in your answer there for me is that the grass that you use everything in your tool, everything in your tackle box. You don't let the fact that there's grass narrow you down, right? And I
That's
guess
right.
I showed my naivety to it because I thought 3 or 4 baits. When I think grass fishing in my neck of the woods, it's usually a single hook thing or a dual hook on a frog or something. But you're saying no, there's what I know, the rattle trap thing. I think we all know ripping rattle traps out of the grass. But
Right.
when I think of grass, I don't think jerk baits because I think of them fouling the hooks. And then when I think of crank baits, I think it's always going to be wrapping around my line. And what I'm hearing you say is that you just have to adjust. It may obviously it can't be a deep jerk bait, or you got to modify some the ways you use the stuff, but you fish the grass just like you fish any other segment of the lake, and checking depth and looking for clues. And I think that's a great tip for everybody.
Yeah, I emphasize to your listeners, be aggressive and make the lures, contact with the vegetation is important. It's crucial at times. You won't get a bite without doing it in many instances. And that speaks for vibrating jigs, chatterbaits, or even swim jigs or lipless or build crankbaits or spinner baits, making contact, that deflection and tearing the bait out of the grass. When it accelerates after contact, it triggers a strike, and it's so crucial. And that's one key element that I'd like your listeners to, at least take away from this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit
No, that
about the
makes it.
equipment, though. I was gonna say, Danny, Bernie has been very, very instrumental in designing a lot of the rod action techniques and field testing them and giving feedback. And I've been with Bernie on some of those trips where he's using like almost prototype stuff. Bernie, what do I need to know about, rod action, the line material and size I'm using if I want to play that grass ripping game? If I want to, get a square bill dug in there and just rip it loose. I mean, we're beyond the 6-pound line and spinning rod at this point. What do you recommend?
Yeah, in the context of that, you're definitely going to want some heavier line, whether it's fluorocarbon. Some guys use braid depending on the bait. And you're going to want a rod that has enough butt section and power to it where you can rip the bait. But you don't want to compromise the action of the lure either. I use X Prides by Shimano. My go-to, whether it's spin or bait casting, is a medium heavy, generally in a 6'10" to 7'2" length, 7 foot being the mean. And I'm going to use everything from 10-pound braid on spinning that may have a fluorocarbon leader or may not. Depends on the lure or the presentation. If I'm throwing a speed Cinco, for instance, which is a swimming type, ultra vibe type worm, and I'm covering water, there's no leader. It's strictly direct braid to the bait, and the bait's constantly moving. If I'm throwing a fluke style bait like a D-shad or something like that, then I'm probably going to have a leader and probably 15-pound fluorocarbon. But for other baits, it's just like the lures. You kind of have to choose your tackle, rod, reel, and line. Balance all that to the lures that you're presenting and the density of the cover that you're dealing with. If it's thinner cover, you can get away with lighter line. If not, you're probably going to need to upgrade your tackle all across the board. You want a powerful reel. You're going to want rods that have some ass to them, some butt section that can really leverage the fish once you hook up, or work the bait aggressively through the tops of the grass, rip it through the grass. And a soft action rod is not going to allow that. You're just going to ball up in the grass, and you're going to not be very effective in your presentation. So you want a crisp action. And that's what I like about Shimano's X Pride rods, is they are crisp. When you snatch the rod tip, that bait's going to react. And that's what I like.
So are you saying you're going to go away from the glass action cranking stick you would normally use, and you're going to use a graphite rod to crank with?
In some cases, yes, and others, no. If the grass is sparse, like thin stranding grass, I'm going to try and use a lighter action composite rod, just because, especially with treble hook lures, because your hook and catch ratio is better with a softer rod, generally speaking, in situations like that with lighter line, smaller treble hooks. But if I'm using, an aggressive approach with single hook lures like, chatterbaits, swim jigs, spinner baits, whatnot, I'm going to use a heavier line, heavier rod.
Right on.
Yep.
And I guess
Yeah,
one thing that
go. You're
too is
fine.
like, okay, I was gonna say, Danny, it's like, and being from the Midwest, like when the grass does die off, the places you find fish when there is grass are probably a lot like the places you find them when there's not. It's about bottom composition, not just the cover. And I was hoping Bernie could speak to reading the vegetation as maybe almost a shortcut to determining what type of cover, or I'm sorry, what type of bottom composition lies beneath as we move through the seasons. Is
Yeah,
that a good way to find hard bottom when they're spawning, et cetera?
yeah, that's a great point. You can definitely uh, cipher bottom composition by the type of grass that's growing there. In most cases, your flat reeds, cattail, flat type reeds, they generally grow on a softer bottom, whereas your bulrushes or your tules, as they call them on the West Coast, grow in a firmer bottom. Maiden cane grass generally grows in a firmer bottom, sand clay mix, or maybe firm mud. It can survive in that. Whereas your pond grasses, your naiads, your milfoils, and hydrilla, they can grow in a variety of bottom types. Generally speaking, it's a softer bottom, but I've seen hydrilla grow in firm white sand bottom as well. It's a very hardy plant. It doesn't take a whole lot to root hydrilla, and hydrilla can feed in the water column as well as from the soil. So that's why it's such a hardier, more diverse plant where you find it. But yeah, lily pads, that's another giveaway. Generally, lily pads grow on soft bottom. And the good thing about that is, and something that your listeners should note, is lily pads have tubers. The root sections grow above the substrate as much as they do below. And that gives fish, especially spawning fish, something firm to bed on in a body of water where there may not be a firm substrate or firm bottom composition. So they'll use the pad roots to actually have their nest, form their nests on, and that basically zeroes you in onto their location during the spring. And holes in the grass, like maiden cane. When you see stovepipe holes in a field of maiden cane in the springtime, there's a good chance that's going to be a spawning bed, or more than one spawning bed. Mixes of cover, cypress trees, duck blinds, lay down logs mixed in with vegetation. Those are other focal places. Kind of getting off on a tangent here, but I'm just trying to give your listeners ideas on where to try and start or focus their efforts. If it seems overwhelming, look for irregularities. Look for seams in the grass where two different types of grass grow together, or some hard type of cover mixes with grass. It can be a dock, the pilings of a dock with grass around the dock. That could be a focal point. Or the void area under the dock, the platform. Grass won't grow where there's no light. So a lot of times bass will relate to the dock simply because there's a void there next to a grass bed. They're more interested in what's living in the grass than using the grass. So you got to think outside the box sometimes about where the fish will relate to, or how they'll position relative to grass.
Yeah, I was going to ask about pads, so I was glad to hear you go that way. That's something we've experienced on my fishery over the past 5 to 6 years, is the almost invasion of lily pads. Bays that used to be 2 to 3 acres of shallow wood cover, now there's solid lily pads. And in that back bay, you used to catch fish there, but now there's maybe 50 to 70 yards of pads to get back to that same fishable water. What I found challenging is moving around in shallow pads without disrupting, the fish out ahead of the boat or whatever.
Yeah.
But hearing you talk about their tubers, it's something I've witnessed. And I think our fishery is actually better because we have more suitable spawning habitat now. It's just a lot less convenient for the anglers because they can get in there and really they don't have to leave. Once they spawn, they can stay in that shallow stuff. In our case, basically till winter, because there's food, there's forage, it's all there.
Yeah, you touched on a great point too, Danny, and that is stealth. When you move through a grass bed, in fact, I'll use a push pole sometimes. Trolling motors nowadays are so much better than they used to be. They're quiet. The brackets are quiet. I'm using the the power pole move, and that thing's extremely silent. I've had good success. Before it came out, I was using the Force by Garmin, very quiet, strong, powerful trolling motor, and it goes through vegetation with a lot of stealth, and that's very important. You know, the fish are going to know you're there before you find them in most cases. I mean, so you got to keep that in mind. In Florida, I was raised using stealth as I moved through grass, but even more important was making long casts. You know, our water, relatively speaking, is shallow. The fish are in most cases less than 5 feet deep, and in a lot of cases less than 3 feet deep. So it becomes more of a lateral approach. You're not able to always flip like I did that day with Vance on a lake here in North Florida, which was a vertical presentation next to the boat. In many cases, you're having to make long casts, a very lateral, horizontal presentation, and trying to keep as much distance between you and the fish. Even though there's a dense field of vegetation, if you go plowing in there with a trolling motor, and that's especially true in lily pads, it's like it just telegraphs your location and your movement to the fish that are in there. And the biggest fish are going to react the first and negatively. They're gonna, it's a flag to them, a red flag. So they're gonna move off. And a lot of times if you're catching small fish, that's the reason why, is you've spooked the larger fish.
That's awesome to think about. What are your thoughts on, so let's say I push pole into an area that's thick. You know, I'm talking the kind of pad fields that you guys, not the isolated 6 or 8 pads, but I'm talking pad fields.
Right.
Do you feel like vegetation, does that give the fish a sense of security where maybe I could push pole my way in and sit quietly for a few minutes? And do they kind of move back around you? Can you, almost like hunting them, can you slide into position and wait for them to show up again? Is that a legit tactic?
Yeah, actually you can do that. You know, I'm noted for being a slow fisherman. I mean, I've glacial speed. I'm slow. I have people come and ask me if I'm broke down. I fish so slow sometimes. But the point is patience is key. And yeah, once you get into an area, I try to move very little. I'll use my power poles a lot. I believe they catch me more fish. Just once I get into an area, I'll drop the poles and I'll fish 360 degrees around the boat in a field of grass. And you'd be surprised how the fish will start showing up. You may spook them initially, but sometimes they're curious. You know, it all comes down to mood of the fish. You know, if they're in a negative mood, nothing you're going to do is right. But there's days when you can't do anything wrong. I mean, you could plow into a grass bed and flip right next to the boat and catch an 8-pounder that was, you know, oblivious to your movements. But that's not usually the case. Usually it's about stealth and a lengthy presentation that catches the most fish in grass.
Last question for me on that topic, because I'm picking your brain for personal reasons now. I know we have a common friend in TH Marine. Yes. I have felt like in pad situations, the HydroWave has helped me. And I feel like in my mind, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this, I kind of look at it again, equating it to hunting. I don't know that I'm bringing them in, but I kind of look at it as a cover scent. The same way I would want some dirt smell on my hunting clothes. I like that HydroWave in those close quartered environments as a cover sound. Maybe it keeps a little bit of other noise down. Have you given any consideration to that? And as a HydroWave,
I have not, to be honest with you. And I think that's ingenious in a way. I have not thought of it to mask your presence. But what I do like about it is I have seen it perform really well, especially on schooling fish related to grass beds, or when bait fish are teeming in an area, but there's not a lot of activity. And you seems like when you fire up that unit, something happens. It can trigger a feed. So yeah, I agree. There are times, but I like your idea. It's food for thought for sure.
Well, it's just that, you know, you're going to, no matter how stealthy you are, you're going to make some noise. So I think maybe putting a few positive sounds out there to go with my negative ones, it can't hurt. But I don't know. That helped me a lot. I appreciate you letting me dig into that, because that was self-serving, guys. For the listeners out there, that was Danny learning how to attack a pad field. And I got some good tidbits there. Vance, we've had Bernie for a little while here. You got anything you want to add? Maybe throw out a little bone for the Southern guys down there?
Well, I will say this. Bernie is a regular Renaissance man. For those who don't know, he's not only written but also illustrated a lot of articles in Bassmaster magazine over the years. His writings have appeared in a lot of places. Bernie, if people want to dig in a little further and read some more of your thoughts on their own, do some research, where are some places we can find your writings? Where's some resources where we can learn a little more about your thought processes?
Yeah, if you go to my website, BernieSchultzFishing.com, there are tabs at the bottom of my image that will lead you to the columns I write at InsideLine.net, which is Gary Yamamoto Custom Baits or Yamamoto Customs. That's one platform that I write for. I do a regular feature there that's basically how I recount my tournament experiences on the Elite Series. And then I also write for Just Fishing, which is a Canadian publication. It's justfishing.ca for Canada. I write for them periodically. And also I'm a frequent contributor to Bassmaster.com. You just follow my columns there and you'll get, there's an archive that you can Google, but I write on numerous platforms. I try to stay as visible as possible. And a lot of my writing is instruction based, techniques or ways to find and catch bass. And, the one thing I'd like to leave with your listeners also is no matter where you go in the country or North America for that matter, or abroad, I've made the same basic concepts work in Japan. I've made them work in Europe. Bass or bass wherever you go, and they relate to grass in much the same way, no matter where if it's Ontario or the Delta in California, the grass lakes in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Gunnersville. It doesn't matter. It's just that there's basic principles. And if you do your homework and learn some basic approaches, be familiar with different techniques and lure choices as they relate to grass, no matter where you go, you're probably going to be effective.
Awesome.
Thank you for your time and your expertise, Bernie. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, and Bernie, when I put this up on the web, I'll put some links to those things you mentioned at the end there, so we can get folks, if they want to learn more, they can read about some of your work. And we want to thank you for sharing your time, and we want to wish you a speedy recovery.
Thank you.
We'll be covering some Elite Series events next year. Probably have Vance's mug at a few of them. So look forward to catching you up with you on the docks again here soon.
I appreciate it, guys.
April.